I woke up one morning a couple weeks ago with this memory of a surreal horror game about eyeballs, drugging patients, alternative medicines, and so on. I remembered the distinct visual style and electronic soundscape that went along with it, but not the name. Well, after some digging, I identified this game as Girl Software's Brighter Day, which I'd first heard of from either Markiplier or PewDiePie just under 11 years ago. Long enough to forget the title, but not long enough to forget about Brighter Day's peculiarities. This got me thinking about the era in which Let's Play channels and indie horror games both simultaneously exploded in popularity, causing a surge in new flash-in-the-pan games from smaller developers, most of which you hear nothing about today. On one hand, you have unique, interesting, and inspired titles, and on the other, some garbage. Back in the early 2010s, the percentage of interesting indie horror games coming out per every Slender clone was pretty low, though it was a lot easier to wow people then. Or maybe YouTubers would just get scared by anything, I couldn't tell you. This era was incredibly unique because the standard for horror games was so low that any amateur developer could hit crazy highs with their game, even if it wasn't that great in retrospect. Nowadays though, a lot of modern viral games, especially in the multiplayer field, have refined every aspect of their game to be as engaging as possible to maximize their users' playtimes, and can very easily soar above anything that deviates or experiments. What I want to talk about is the trickle-down effect of this trend and how it's impacted indie horror games, forcing them into the same viral video game life cycle as something like, I don't know, fucking Fall Guys? A lot of the indie horror titles that I enjoyed from this time were doomed to obscurity, despite having a moment in the same spotlight that titans of the genre did. Some didn't hold up at all in quality, while others failed just because they weren't made with the same ideals as more successful games in mind. Their creators weren't repeatedly striking while the iron was hot to milk the first bits of success their games generated. Five Nights at Freddy's would be a great example of that, with the string of 4 sequels made in the first year of the franchise, because Scott Cawthon just made games really fast, and you know, I would too. Additionally, the unexpected success of some titles such as Baldi's Basics that start off as short and sweet game jam entries kind of forced their developers down the pathway of, you know, marketable plushie, sequels, spin-offs, you get the drill. Tattletale was a Mascot horror game that came between the success of FNAF and when people started calling games of its kind Mascot horror, because that had become defined as its own ubiquitous subgenre. This game used to stress me out with how much you had to keep track of while taking care of your legally distinguishable Furby and trying to not, you know, die. Along with the titles like Bendy and the Ink Machine or Hello Neighbor, Tattletale was treated like the next big indie horror hit, with theories, songs, let's plays, etc. But the developers never exhausted the IP of all its potential as we've seen before. The game was put together by a small team of artists and developers who are already well known, and almost immediately went on to do bigger and cooler things. A one and done experience. There is a balance to be struck here, however. Not every game needs to be in the limelight forever. To an extent, this is a natural progression that all games eventually follow, but it's a shame when it feels like a game you really enjoyed was stunted somehow. Scrutinized is a 2020 horror game from Reflex Studios, the development team behind Rides with Strangers and the Welcome to the Game series, which is expecting a third entry soon. Scrutinized follows Luna, the protagonist and a criminal intelligence analyst leading a neighborhood crime watch program. The opening retells the story of how a serial killer in the area, dubbed the Blue Blood Killer, turned from a sensationalized headline you could forget about soon enough, into a pervasive threat and an omnipresent reality, with Luna's cousin, a police officer, becoming one of the Blue Blood Killer's many murder victims. After her cousin Sarah's death, Luna has become completely captivated by the goal of tracking down her murderer. For the next 5 or 10 nights, depending on which difficulty you've chosen, you'll be shuffling through both true and false criminal reports, and using a wide array of tools to eliminate potential suspects, from police records and debit card history to tapping into phones to read text conversations. Amidst this search, you're being tracked down by 2 different people who are attempting to break into your house and kill you. While trying to accurately decide if criminal reports are real threats or worries that can be shredded, you have to keep full track of your surroundings, down to which lights are on in your home, what sounds are going on outside your house, and the locks on each and every door and window. Around half of the gameplay takes place on your computer, in which you are completely focused on the screen, with a second or so long animation playing of Luna unfocusing from the screen and standing up, playing each time you get up. That second is always so stressful because because you have to wait and see if somebody's in your home or not instead of a quick look around to check your surroundings, and time is precious here. Scrutinized is a perfect example of a game that balances its stress factor well enough that you can both pick it up incredibly easily and be terrified all the way through. However, the game's reception was stunted by the mild controversy surrounding Welcome to the Game 2 just prior to the release of Scrutinized. While this rather petty drama stemming from the misuse of an admin panel is mostly seen as water under the bridge now, the reputation of the Welcome to the Game series was still quite rocky for some time. And as the bulk of this controversy happened just in time for the release of Scrutinized, the game was overshadowed for years. With the recent release of the Welcome to the Game 3 demo and the Volt for Holt video about its predecessor, which you should go check out, a lot more eyes and appreciation have been turned towards the Welcome to the Game series. However, I feel Scrutinized has yet to see that same type of newfound appreciation. Despite being an intense horror experience I can rarely find elsewhere, streamers and Let's Players have started to highlight Scrutinized in recent years, but I believe the game still hasn't achieved anywhere near the amount of praise it should have. Generally, horror games tend to be rougher in the replay value department. Maybe I am generalizing with bad examples here, but I feel like they are the genre you have the highest likelihood of only playing once. Even if a horror game isn't necessarily story-based, you've already seen the scares. You already know what will happen if you do the same thing. Replaying a horror game with a different perspective will start to unravel how the game was made, breaking the immersion to some extent. As a result, many horror games end up being a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Moirai starts in a small village with a handful of NPCs waiting to greet you. A priest tells you the story of Julia, a woman whose husband had passed away just a year prior, and since, she's recently gone missing. Later, you learn about Julia's kid, who also disappeared in a similar fashion, further unsettling the village. One kid continues a rumor of gold found in a nearby cave. He's been too scared to enter, as they say a little boy will haunt you over your shoulder. Past the farm, you'll find a lumberjack who'd like you to explore this cave to investigate strange moans he'd heard recently. Upon entering, the previous man's brother gives you a knife for protection. There are a fair few eerie items you'll spot along the way, including something shiny buried out of reach within a hole in the wall, and the bones of what we can only assume to be Julia's aforementioned child. One pathway leads to an encounter with a bloodied up farmer holding a knife, and you're given the option to ask him questions about what he's doing here. Additionally, you're given the option to let that farmer pass or attack him. As you delve deeper into the cave system, you run into Julia herself. She's in critical condition. After failing to find her husband and child who'd gone missing in this cave, she's attempted to kill herself. She also mentions that her husband had found a gold nugget that would have been worth a lot to their family, although he's hid it out of apparent distrust, and it seems we'd found it before her. Julia then asks you if you're able to help fully put her out of her misery. Either way, she coughs up blood, which gets on you in return. Now that you have blood on you, this is the perfect time for someone to run into you, and of course, they're going to have some questions. Here, you can write answers, and this is when you quickly realize these are the same questions you asked the villager just moments prior, with your answers now being sent to someone else's game. The game ends shortly after with a message telling you that your fate will be decided by another player, even giving you a space to submit your name and email address to learn of your fate. As the game got more popular, more players changed the experience by putting in troll answers, knowing how the game would play out already, and adding on to the next oblivious player's confusion. In 2017, Moirai was pulled from online stores as the developers gave up on upkeeping the game following a series of bugs that allowed players to fill up the database of player responses with explicit content. The game was widely praised at the time for how unique the concept was. There are some remakes floating around online, though you're only supposed to experience this game once, usually on your own instead of through a let's play in which someone plays it for you. It wasn't meant to hit some of the same beats other vaguely similar horror games do, because the experiment aspect was the main focal point of the game, just building an interesting story for the purpose of reeling the users in. As Moirai is delisted from game carriers, it's a 10-minute experience, and its shutdown was nearly a decade ago, the game has mostly been forgotten. There's very little you can take from it now that it's gone, besides maybe insight into how players interact with games and how players interact with players. Key smashes, real answers, joke answers, obscenities, and a secret fifth group that pushed the game's limits too far. I've been thinking about horror mods of pre-existing video games because they're uniquely interesting. Any game with its own decently sized modding or ROM hacking community has seen its fair share of horror applications. Some use the game as a base, as if it were its own engine, just because that's what the creator knows best, while some others ask the centuries-old question of, what if Mario had big red eyes with hyper-realistic blood coming out of them? While I was researching for this video, I was going through a variety of games I vaguely remember seeing YouTubers play many years ago, when I stumbled upon Slender's Woods. It was an old Slender fan game from 2012 that looked relatively promising, and to my surprise when I ran the game, I saw a file being loaded named Duke 3D. Yes, this standalone horror game was built using eDuke32, a game engine piled together from the reverse-engineered guts of the Build engine, most famously used for boomer shooters like Duke Nukem 3D and Blood. To be fair, a lot of these mods were built with vastly different goals and ambitions in mind. The ones that lean on the cheap creepypasta side are usually meant for a quick scare via twisting the nostalgia you have for a beloved game from your childhood into some, you know, evil, creepy-deepy bullshit. These are a far cry from the large-scale rebuilds of games like Half-Life that use the engine, as well as various aspects of the initial game, to tell an entirely new story, combine old mechanics with fresh ideas, and completely flip the gameplay on its head. In a similar low-budget fashion, I couldn't explore the topic of early 2010s horror games much without talking about creepypasta games that were all the rage. Even years before Slender had its heyday, games like Escape from Lavender Town and Luna Game had already found some success within online gaming communities. While nobody expects a huge budget production out of a creepypasta game, it's worth mentioning how many of them were made with the most bare-bones tools possible. Both of the titles I mentioned previously are some of the earliest examples of semi-viral creepypasta games. The two of them were created in early 2011 with GameMaker and some images ripped off the internet, usually as pranks to scare people in the same online communities as their creators. Developer Adrian Dittrich also later noted that Escape from Lavender Town was made in a total of 4 hours. SCP-087-B is a 2012 freeware game in which you traverse a never-ending haunted staircase, based on an entry from the SCP Foundation wiki, and created in a program only known nowadays for its backwards compatibility with Windows 95. The Uncle Who Works for Nintendo is a 2014 interactive story by Michael Lutz, who'd already had an impact on the creepypasta sphere of the internet by creating the Smile Dog story years prior. You start by picking your best friend's name. From this screen onward, every choice you make matters. You're cast as a kid going to a Friday night sleepover. Your friend, who I called Brandon on my first playthrough, has every new console, unreleased games, insider info, because his uncle supposedly works for Nintendo. Some of the dialogue is hindered by fuzzy memory, suggesting the events of the story are possibly being retold to us. The first example of this being the beverage your friend's father was drinking at dinner. You thought it was a beer, but he doesn't drink. Without progressing, you can branch off into thinking about this detail before coming back to see the story has changed as you correct your memory. After dinner, you go back to the den to play games all night. From 6 to midnight, you're given a selection of choices, an important one being starting conversations with Brandon, usually while he's playing a game by himself. If you look through the family photos framed in his house, you start to notice something strange. His brother isn't in any of the photos. You know Brandon had a brother because something he said in a conversation you recall stuck with you. Another option allows you to recall a story of the elusive Mew that Brandon's uncle put on his Pokemon save. It would one-shot anything it fought, and it wasn't anything like a Mew you could hack in. Brandon made a note of how jealous his brother was, and it only took some days before the allure he'd created would fade away and people would stop caring about the game altogether. It starts to rain hard later in the night. You ask him if this storm will be as bad as the last one, and he says that he doesn't remember the last one. He should, as it was apparently bad enough to take down trees. While you say it was only a few weeks ago, Brandon had already supposedly moved in that short time frame. Over this course of time, you slowly realize more peculiarities and start to unravel Brandon's lies. That unraveling of lies is the most thrilling part to me, with the building confusion in this story turning into a sinking set of suspicions. Something is very wrong, but you just don't know what. There are 6 total endings you can achieve by going down different routes, and even then, you still may not see all the possible dialogue. This game is funny now that I think of it, as it's gotta be the only story-based game of its kind with multiple endings that you're encouraged to complete all of in one sitting. As far as I'm aware, there's no way to save your progress, meaning to see all of the game's content, you'd have to finish the whole experience in one shot. This isn't something you check out yourself after seeing all the endings through a full game Let's Play. The point that I'm trying to paint with these stories is that I'm not a fan of the vicious cycle of internet virality being applied to the medium of indie horror games, but that's just the nature of the internet and how games work. Most of my favorite games that have been subjected to it weren't meant to be in the limelight the same way other titles were. Games like Lethal Company and Phasmophobia, both of which I enjoy, no Roblox bias on the former, are games that I can totally see being viral horror games. They're multiplayer titles with tons of opportunities for different playstyles, things to do, mods to try, etc. But it's very strange to see single player games that are only really ever meant to be experienced once thrown into the same wheel of life, or the developer forcing it into that cycle because of its unexpected success. Moirai would be a perfect example with how it was put front and center in the rotation of Let's Play channels, before that same attention would turn around and ruin the experience and the game entirely. In some cases, it's kinda disheartening to see developers get a hit of this and try to pander to internet relevance with something as personal and time-consuming to make as an indie game, though I understand why, people have to keep the lights on. If you dig into what's popular within the Let's Play sphere right now, you'll find several notable examples that are entirely shameless about it. An underappreciated, thought-provoking experience can see half the success of a game made solely for obnoxious streamers to scream at, taking every shortcut possible along the way, and both will come down just as fast. Thanks for watching.